It seems like disappointment is the new mood in the Kremlin. While Russia's elites sigh in exhaustion over a never-ending conflict, Donald Trump boldly declares, "Peace? Easy. Just give me until my inauguration." Meanwhile, Putin clings to his brilliant plan as whispers grow louder in the corridors of power. Maybe it's time to call it quits. So we've got a war-weary Russian elite, Trump promising to fix everything over dinner at Mar-a-Lago, and Putin, who apparently just doesn't know when to stop. What will come of it all? Let's dive in and find out. Peace talks between world leaders. They sound promising on paper, right? But what if the path to ending a war actually makes the world more dangerous? Today we're exploring a diplomatic dance that's raising eyebrows across the globe.
Well, looking at this potential meeting between Trump and Putin, there are so many layers to unpack. The timing alone is fascinating, announcing talks before even taking office.
You know what's really interesting here? During their last meeting in Helsinki in 2018, Trump stunned everyone by calling Putin's offer to investigate election meddling incredible. Yet his administration went on to impose some of the toughest sanctions on Russia.
That kind of contradiction between personal diplomacy and actual policy really shows how complex these relationships can be.
And now we're seeing something similar playing out. Trump's talking about ending the war in Ukraine before his January inauguration, while Putin has these extensive demands, including Ukraine withdrawing from 4 regions and giving up its NATO ambitions.
Speaking of those demands, it's worth noting that we're talking about roughly 20% of Ukraine's territory here. That's an area larger than Switzerland.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Kremlin spokesman Peskov is saying there are no conditions required for these leaders to meet, which is completely different from normal diplomatic protocols.
The whole Mar-a-Lago angle adds another unusual element. I mean, conducting major international diplomacy at a private club?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time Trump's used his properties for diplomacy. Remember those North Korea talks? But what's fascinating here is how Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov responded to Trump's call for an immediate ceasefire.
Oh, how did that play out?
So Lavrov essentially rejected the immediate ceasefire idea while still keeping the door open for negotiations. It's like saying thanks, but we'll do this our way. Classic Russian diplomatic positioning.
The humanitarian stakes here are just enormous. We're approaching 3 years of conflict with devastating consequences.
You know what's really telling? The timing of this announcement. Making these statements as president-elect sends a signal not just to Russia, but to Ukraine and NATO allies too. It's like moving pieces on a chessboard before you're even at the table.
Well, that must be causing some serious concern among NATO members who've been supporting Ukraine.
Exactly, and here's why. Any deal would need to consider not just Russia and Ukraine's positions, but also NATO's security interests, EU economic concerns, and broader global stability. It's like trying to solve 5 different puzzles simultaneously.
The historical parallels are pretty striking too, aren't they? Rushed peace deals rarely lead to lasting stability.
Absolutely right. Look at the Treaty of Versailles, ended World War I, but created conditions that led to World War II. And now we're dealing with similar levels of complexity, but in a nuclear age with instant global communications and economic interdependence.
So what do you think we should be watching for in the coming months?
Well, 3 key things. First, watch how Ukraine responds to these potential talks. Second, keep an eye on NATO's reaction, especially from countries bordering Russia. And third, this is crucial, look at how China positions itself, especially since Trump mentioned potentially meeting with Xi Jinping too.
That's quite a diplomatic web being woven there.
You know what makes this whole situation so unprecedented? We're watching real-time diplomacy unfold in an era where social media posts can influence international relations as much as formal diplomatic cables. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the whole world is watching.
And it seems like every new development adds another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation.
That's exactly right. Whether this meeting happens or not, it's already shaping global politics. And that's what makes this story so crucial to follow. It's not just about 2 leaders meeting, it's about the future of international security architecture as we know it. While Donald Trump plans his bold moves to negotiate peace with Putin and end the war in Ukraine, The situation on the other side of the table seems far from stable. Inside Russia, cracks are forming among the political elite, with growing dissatisfaction over Putin's prolonged conflict. As Trump promises swift resolutions, the Kremlin faces mounting pressure from within, disillusionment, economic strain, and a war that seems to have no clear end in sight. Could these internal tensions be the key to shaping Trump's strategy, or will they complicate his plans for peace? Let's explore the other side of this unfolding story. You know what keeps Russian officials up at night? According to shocking new reports, it's not just the war in Ukraine, it's the very real possibility that Russia's population could be cut in half by the end of this century.
Those demographic projections are staggering. And what makes this report from Medusa particularly interesting is how it reveals growing disappointment within Putin's inner circle.
Well, let's dig into what these officials are actually saying. 10 high-ranking sources, including people close to Putin's administration, express something we rarely hear: open frustration. One government source literally said, "We're already tired of waiting. It feels like you're going deeper and deeper every day."
That level of candor from inside the Kremlin is pretty unusual, isn't it? Especially when they're talking about expecting sanctions relief, but getting more economic pain instead.
And here's where it gets really interesting. There's this quote about Putin himself that's quite revealing. They said, "The president likes to fight. It's exciting for him." That gives us a glimpse into why this conflict might be dragging on despite the mounting costs.
Speaking of costs, let's talk about that recent major economic blow: Ukraine terminating Russian gas transit through its territory. That's what John Kirby called one of Russia's most costly defeats.
You know what's fascinating about this whole situation? There's this growing divide within Putin's circle. Some want the war to end, while others, particularly security officials, are frustrated that Putin hasn't gone far enough with mobilization.
So what do you think these internal tensions mean for Russia's future?
Well, Professor Harley Balzer from Georgetown University made an interesting point about this. He suggested that winning the war in Ukraine might actually be the smaller problem compared to whether Russia will remain a viable country afterward.
That's quite a statement. And it ties into the demographic crisis you mentioned earlier, doesn't it?
Exactly. We're not just talking about military casualties here. Russia is facing what experts call a perfect storm. You've got this massive brain drain as young professionals flee the country, technological isolation cutting them off from crucial innovations, and economic sanctions that keep getting tighter.
And all of this while these officials had apparently been hoping 2024 would be the year the war would end.
Right. But then came the Kursk incursion in August 2024, and those hopes started fading fast. What's particularly striking is how these officials seem to recognize the danger, but feel powerless to change course.
That must be incredibly frustrating for them, watching these long-term problems pile up while the war continues.
And here's something else to consider. Even if the war ended tomorrow, Russia would still be facing these massive structural challenges. The demographic crisis, the brain drain, the technological isolation. These aren't problems that can be solved quickly.
That really brings home why these officials are so concerned about the country's future viability.
You know what makes this situation even more complex? Russia's isolation from global technology and innovation isn't just affecting their military capabilities. It's impacting everything from medical equipment to agricultural development.
So we're really looking at potential impacts that could last for generations.
Exactly. And that's what makes this story so significant. It's not just about the current war anymore. It's about whether Putin's decisions today might fundamentally undermine Russia's future as a major power.
That's quite a sobering way to look at it, but it really captures the magnitude of what's at stake here.
Well, I think that brings us to the heart of today's story. Sometimes the biggest threats to a nation's future aren't external enemies, but the consequences of its own choices. Thanks for joining us today.